Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third Zoom talkback session after our third plenary of this year's 2021 Justice and Jesuit Higher Education Conference. Our plenary was at 2 o'clock today, premiered on YouTube on racial justice and the mission of Jesuit higher education. It was moderated by Dr. Kay Whitehead, and it included our participants, Dr. Keesha Middlemass, Dr. Yohuru Williams, and melisandeshort-colomb. We're so excited that you've joined us for the talkback session. I would be remiss if I did not give a huge shout out to Paula Pascula Ferra from Loyola University, Maryland, who curated this incredible panel and prepared them for their time together. So thank you so much, Paula. She's on the call, but like many of us, also shuffling childcare. So thank you, Paula. So my name is Andrea Whistler, and I'm the local co-host at Georgetown University for the conference. And our conferences, we're about the halfway point. We continue with our fourth plenary on Wednesday and 2 more next week. You can check out the full schedule at justice2021.sched, that's sched.com. I also want to give a 2-second shout out to also say, please view the poster presentations that are listed in the sketch. There's actually several on racial justice and intersecting themes of today's plenary and discussion. So I highly recommend that you take some time in the next few weeks to check them out while they're on sketch. They will transition and move to a digital scholarship repository that is open to the public on Georgetown's library website. I want to say thank you to my great colleague and dear friend Ray Hsu, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for Social Justice at Georgetown University, and who will be moderating this conversation with our participants. If you have a question, which I'm sure many of you do, please put it in the chat to myself or our wonderful colleague, Chanel Robertson, who is our Assistant Director for Youth Justice Initiatives at the CSJ. So please put it in the chat to one of us. At 4:15, we'll transition to Julio Vargas, who is the Director of the Center for Service Learning at Rockhurst University for our Ignatian examen. So thank you so much, Julio, for doing that. We are very excited that Dr. Whitehead can pop in and out with us today. This is the time of her radio show, and so she is playing multiple screens and microphones right now, and we are grateful for the time that she can spend with us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ray, and I'm going to spotlight our other participants.
Thanks so much, Andrea. And thank you everyone here for joining our live question response session today for the Racial Justice Plenary. Hope you all had a chance to view the YouTube video either at the premiere or will sometime later. And I hope you enjoyed the panel as much as I did. Allow me to start the session by thanking our panelists today for sharing your history, sharing your insights, sharing your pain, and your inspiring accomplishments in your work for justice. I really appreciate today the conversations today about how you bring yourselves and your positions in higher education into advancing racial justice. It really came through to me how you found your way to live out this work and across and through different disciplines. I appreciate that you all named that the work for change from the individual to institutional, such as the longitudinal changes that Dr. Williams named, or the ways you've incorporated rest and personhood. I found myself reflecting on how I can bring that to my own work and to my own communities. I was struck by a thread in the panel that while the work has been going on too long, that we all have a responsibility to support and educate others to carry forward the work for change in the future. So my question, if I can pose it to you all to start off with, is to all the new faculty of color, to the new administrators and staff of color, and the students of color who are viewing today's panel and Q&A, what is a piece of advice you'd offer to them to continue and advance the work and fight in the same ways you each have? And how about I start with you, Dr. Middlemass?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keesha Middlemass. I'm at Howard University in the Department of Political Science, and I study prisoner reentry from the public policies to the lived experiences, doing ethnography, interviews, focus groups, and then connecting those lived experiences to public policies. So when you start thinking about race and higher education, regardless of the type of institution, I think it's really important for faculty of all colors, faculty of all races and ethnicities, to be available to help minority students, underrepresented students in different groups, to actually find their people on campus. Sometimes that is the biggest thing that faculty can do, is literally to know who is the president of the Black Student Union, if you've got a Black Student Union on campus, that you can give an email to a student immediately. Who is the president of the LGBTQ plus? If it's not an organization, but a group, who can help students that are underrepresented find their people, I think is a real basic service that faculty members can do, because we interact with students in the classroom, in our offices. If your campus is small enough, once we go back post-pandemic, you see them on campus. So I think it's really important for faculty of all colors just to find access points for students, particularly freshmen, first year students, to find their people, but then faculty also should be introduced. So for new faculty, don't just say, hi, I'm in such and such department, but also say, hey, I know so-and-so that is another Black woman and she might be in physics. So let me do an email invitation to the two of you, and you can facilitate the conversation that way.
Any advice you'd offer, Mrs. Short-Colomb?
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me here today, and for everyone participating and asking questions and being interested in what we're doing and talking about here. I came into Georgetown in 2017 as a non-traditional student. I was a lot older than my classmates, by generations, not just years. And I was there for a specific reason. The administration said a thing. It was a general thing, and that was, we will recognize the descendants of enslaved families sold by the Jesuits who can meet the qualifications to come to Georgetown as legacy students. As a fully actualized Black American woman, I needed to come and see what that meant. These are our children. So what I learned most about Georgetown, I can speak specifically of Georgetown, is that students are told that they're in a bubble. You're in a bubble of exclusivity, and you're special, and you're here, and you made it. And that closes the bubble rather than opening the bubble. And I realized that curriculums are set in years of study and research and academic strenuous study and learning. And that is passed on to students, which is admirable. But if you have learned the lost cause narrative in the institutions in which you are educated, and you bring the implicit biases of your education experience into your educating experience, you are not serving your students well. So I would implore professors and teachers to check your implicit biases in your own heart and see where they lay and question them, so that you can live up to the calling and teach students to understand critical thought and the importance of doing for other people. My coming to Georgetown was certainly an act of faith between the administration and myself. They believed that I could do something here, and I believed that I could do something here. I don't think at the time any of us knew what that thing would be, but 8 semesters later, here we are. My classmates have graduated and they have gone out into the world as the first class of students to interact entirely with the experience of Jesuit slaveholding and human trafficking as part of their education as undergraduates and student activists at Georgetown. That's remarkable. And they have forever changed the culture of the institution, which also pledged that it would be forever into the future, interacting with its history to better prepare students in the present for their lives in the future.
Dr. Shu, may I add one other comment?
Please.
So I would like to encourage all faculty members to look at their syllabi and see how many non-white men are actually in your reading list. And I'm not talking about 1 week that you're just going to talk about Black people and you've got the Black authors for 1 week's of reading for a graduate class or 1 week of reading for an undergraduate class, but purposely look through your readings and find different perspectives about the same topic. It's so easy now, JSTOR. The topic can be found. You can look at people's pictures, and also think about faculty members that are not at the top 25 PhD granting institutions, whatever your major is or whatever your discipline is, that there's lots of good work being done at liberal arts colleges. I know you're Jesuits, I know you're at Jesuit schools, I know you know this, but I also then encourage you not to just have, I like people at University of Michigan, but not just have people that have graduated from the University of Michigan on your syllabi. Like, go a little deeper than just, oh, I'm going to add white women to my syllabus and we'll expand it, but go a little deeper. Are there scholars doing work that are publishing not in the top 3 journals of your discipline? But think broadly, because that will then help in the education of yourself and also then the education of 21st century students.
Thank you for that addition. And allow me to welcome Dr. Williams, who's joining our session today. Thank you so much for joining us. I have a question from Dr. Yavne. If I could read the question, it says, Dr. Middlemass spoke movingly about the relief of being at Howard, where she no longer has to serve as a spokesperson of color, speaking up in response to each specific tragic incident of racial injustice. For those of us who are white faculty at predominantly white institutions, how can we best support our colleagues in responding to such incidents?
And I added Naomi to the spotlight. Naomi, do you want to add anything to your question that Ray just read out for you? Thanks for being here.
I thank you so much for this wonderful panel. And I sort of apologize for saying, oh, and what can I as a white woman do? But I really felt so strongly when you were talking about that need for rest that I and my colleagues would like to help you do that. So thank you for responding and understanding where the question is coming from.
Thank you for the question. And I know it's really hard for when, and I was trained at University of Georgia. I've been on faculty at predominantly white universities prior to coming to Howard. And so being one of literally at one liberal arts college, I was the only Black social scientist. So pick all your disciplines and I was the only Black one. So whenever there was a shooting, police hostility, something about criminal justice, I would be tapped And I felt like I needed to say yes, despite the emotional labor and the actual work, because no one else was going to do it. And so a lot of scholars, not of color, study race, study policing, study the criminal justice system. Like, don't think that you just have to have a Black face talk about Black issues. And I think that's an important part, that if someone comes with the credibility of their research, their time in the field, their whatever they do, it could be through community service, it could be so many different ways that you can talk about it. I'm just talking about sort of Black and policing, and because George Floyd, and we're just past the 1-year anniversary. But that idea is there's other people to ask, and just because a colleague is Black does not mean that they actually research Black things, for lack of a better phrase.
Would anybody like to add anything else?
I get the question often in conversations, what should we do? We're white people. And my response is often, or my privilege. You know, I get that I'm privileged, and there's some angst and there's some pain associated with that. You've had a great life. My response is, use your privilege, use your great life, get amongst yourselves and your peers and your family and your church and your community, and you have the conversation. You don't have to ask me. I'm busy trying to survive being Black in America. I cannot assume the weight of your burden as I carry mine. If you've had it, use it.
Thank you so much for that question. And I have a question from Chanel Bullock. The question is, I'd love it if one of the speakers could talk about how large of an issue environmental injustice is in relation to racial justice.
Well, I can say that environmental injustice, and the decimation of the planet is detrimental to the race of Homo sapiens that occupy the planet and all living things. Specifically in America, Black neighborhoods and communities have been built in and around dump sites, or I'm from Louisiana. We have Cancerel. We make everything that you need as Americans in Louisiana, and populations all up and down the river. Black populations, but not only, are disproportionately affected by cancer because of the number of plants that produce the things that Americans must have. So there's no, there is a separation, yes. People have been disenfranchised in this place, specifically by the color of their skin. However, that does not negate the fact that we're all human beings. And we continue to perpetuate the mythology of race when we say everything is about race, when in fact it's about racism. Because race, if we're all honest, I said this before, John Locke and them made that up.
I think that when you think about environmental justice, we're talking about, and if I center it in the United States, well, let's just say North America, and you start thinking about the Arctic melting. The Inuit populations, First Nation populations are going to be literally decimated because they won't be able to live because there'll be no ice. And then you start thinking about both coasts, the East and West Coast, but also then the Gulf Coast, and the erosion of land. And so the environmental issue just related to the rising sea levels are going to be problematic for anybody within probably 50 or 100 miles of a coast. And so that is going to rearrange how we deal with rising ocean levels. But you also have to think about the dislocation of people because of rising seas are going to predominantly hit poor people, regardless of their race. They will not have the funds to actually relocate in time. And so I do not want to diminish the issue of racism in the United States, but environmental issues are going to impact more communities over time.
Thank you for that. And for those who want to continue the conversation about environmental justice, there is a plenary on environmental justice next Thursday, the 24th as well. And there are amazing opportunities to continue the intersections there. Next question comes from Susan from University of Chicago, and she will unmute and actually the question's for you, Dr. Williams.
Hi, Dr. Williams, and to the entire panel, thank you so much for your incredible words and your wisdom today. Dr. Williams, you and I share a love for Pedro Arrupe and his, I think, ongoing and continually relevant wisdom. And so my question is this. As the number of actual Jesuits decreases, I have seen at some Jesuit universities sort of anxiety around how do we preserve the mission. And sometimes, unfortunately, how they can come out is when there is a difficult or a tricky question about how we respond missionally to the challenges of the world, especially the current ones that have been facing us. There can be sort of this default stance of, well, whatever the Jesuit says, just do that. And that's sort of that's what we need to do. The order in the United States is predominantly white, and the folks coming in are predominantly white. And while many of these men have, long histories of doing great work, while I know specifically there's especially a group of young Jesuits who are really interrogating questions of anti-racism, how do we as institutions think about what working for mission looks like from that intersectional place that certainly justice and the gospel calls us to?
Wow, it's a phenomenal question. I would say a couple of things in response to that. Having been at Fairfield University and having been educated at Fairfield Prep and University of Scranton, I always felt, even when people were talking about the coming moment when we were going to be on campuses where there were no Jesuits at some point in the future, and now we're there, that we had to move to a model of talking about what it means to be Jesuit inspired. And that moves us out of the realm of assuming that the individuals, by virtue of their position within the church, have something extraordinary about them inherently in that position, and that the value system that we impart through Ignatian pedagogy, through Examine, through the things that we associate with Jesuit education, in and of themselves should prepare people, the people that we train, the faculty that we bring into those institutions, to do that work going forward, and to do it in a way that privileges the values, if not always the practice of the order itself. And I think that's the critical piece here. I think it's easy in a lot of ways, and I talk about this in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, for people to put the responsibility and onus on some office. So if the prosecution fails to find Derek Chauvin responsible, if the police chief doesn't hold officers accountable. But I believe that there are elements of this that also deal with individual accountability. And I think what Arrupe calls us to is to interrogate what privilege we all have. He's very specific about that in that speech from Valencia, Spain. I have privilege. and to commit ourselves individually in meaningful ways to doing the work of anti-racism and justice on our campuses that transcend the order. We all know this because we've all been in those spaces where we've had to push the Jesuits. We've also been in spaces where we've been pushed by the mission to respond and to think differently about certain issues of import. The question came up of environmental justice. I think about Pauli Murray writing powerfully in Proud Shoes about how our seedy rundown school, as she put it, told us if we had any place that was set off, prescribed, unwanted by the white people. I think about what's happening now with efforts to deal with environmental justice within the context of what Dr. Middlemass talked about. Faculty who are in related areas who can use mission as a conduit to address issues of segregation and inequality that aren't obvious because everyone jumps on education and police brutality. Few people think about access to food deserts. Few people think about access to healthcare. Few people think about reimagining food systems. Few people think about pest control as a civil rights issue, which it was. In Washington, D.C., I think about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the history of SNCC. One of the issues that the SNCC took on in Washington, D.C., and one of the issues that SNCC core took on in New York City was trash collection and pest control. We don't think about those as challenges to civil rights, but they're challenges to basic human rights. And they all impact the way that young people show up for school and the way people feel part or not part of a community. So collectively, all of those issues define the experience of people of color in this country, those on the margins in this country. And I always say that margins are drawn. What the Jesuits should remind us of is that as easily as they can be drawn, they can be reimagined. And what Ignatian pedagogy and what examine and the other attributes that we associate with the Jesuits in particular should call us to do is take on that responsibility individually and move from Jesuit to Jesuit inspired. What does JI mean? I think that marks an opportunity for Jesuit education in the future. And I also think it puts us in a position where we're in the driver's seat and we don't have the easy answer of, well, we're waiting on this person to do something or that person to do something. No, it's baked into the DNA of, and DNA for me is an acronym, our dreams, how we nurture those dreams, and ultimately how we act upon those dreams in moments when our values are challenged. So we have to start seeing that as kind of part and parcel of the DNA of what it means to be Jesuit or Jesuit inspired.
Thank you for that, Dr. Williams. I really appreciate how you are finding ways to connect what Arupe is saying nearly 50 years ago still has relevance today. So really appreciate that, especially the idea of like seeking the so-called margin is an attempt to redraw and recenter what is the margin as well. So thank you. Allow me to welcome Dr. Whitehead. Thank you so much for juggling the many demands and joining us in our live Q&A today. Let's see, I think a question that we have here is
Ray, if I could can I jump in for a second, Ray? There's a great question from Anthony Medina. Anthony, would you be willing for me to put you on the spotlight to ask it?
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anthony Medina. I'm at Gonzaga University. Melisandre, you noted that there's an importance for students to get outside of their bubbles. And at almost all of our institutions in AJCU, there are ways that students, staff, and faculty can engage in their communities and get outside of their campus bubbles. Service learning, co-curricular opportunities, campus ministry, etc. In my experience as a practitioner, but also as a student, these things are really messy, and they often pair our students in communities of color. How do we, as practitioners, people doing this work, faculty, professionals in the field, students, student leaders, how do we, what's important for us as we're coordinating these efforts to consider, how do we mitigate harm to our communities from our students, from our staff members, from our faculty?
Well, great question. What is the value of the discomfort zone? what challenges are met in those uncomfortable places where everything that you have believed, what you have been taught, what you think you believe, what you might want to believe, is in fact tested. Because you have to listen to someone's narrative or story or history that is completely different from what you have learned or what you have been taught. I had a young man who was who had gone through all of the Jesuit education, elementary school, high school, school projects and summer things to do things for people that Jesuit boys and girls go off and do in the summer. And we were in a library class in the Booth Family Center. We were talking about Jesuit slaveholding and the sale of my family and the 40 families who were sold in 1838, as well as their 150-year enslavement prior to the sale. So the young man was getting very, very uncomfortable hearing these things about the Jesuits, whom are beloved by many, but not me. So he took exception to the things that I was saying about the institution that is the Society of Jesus of North America, and said, you can't say those things because what their mission is and what they have done makes all of that worth it. I said, to you, but not to my people. So if you are only at peace and comfortable if you are only learning and excelling in your comfort zone, then you are not being challenged to grow.
Would anyone else like to add to that response?
Yes, thank you. I always feel as if it's important to, before I have students do any extracurricular, outside, whatever we're calling it these days, when they've got internships or externships, that I probably spend 2 or 3 weeks, and I'm not talking classroom setting, sort of, I had a, it's called the Food Matters Lab, and had 6 undergraduate students. And before we interacted with participants at a major food bank, we sat and talked about who shows up at the food bank. And basically, I explained to them, without using the word ethnography, how do we learn from participants? We are not there to impose our values on them, but we are there to learn about their experiences, so then we can advocate for different policies. We can advocate for the food bank to do things different ways. Let's find where the gaps are. And they, you know, they rolled their eyes the first week, and they happened to be all young women. 4 of them were white, 1 was Latina, and 1 was Black. And so we talked about race, we talked about income, we talked about what does poverty look like from your perspective of privilege? Because I didn't want my students to go to the food bank and literally make faces by the smell of homelessness. And that allowed them to then be in a space that they knew they should be respectful of participants and not be imposing their values, principles, privilege on the participants. And now one of my students graduated from the University of Maryland, and she was like, do you know, all that helped me now get the next job that she graduated, what, a month ago, and now has a job, which is always a good thing. But she talked about that 2 or 3 weeks that I spent about meeting people in the field versus her going in with her misconceived notions of who were the participants. I think that would do a world of good before you sent students out to do good.
Mr. Medina, thank you for that question. Switching gears to talking back to about faculty, I have a question from Joe DeFeo. Are there any suggestions for helping faculty reimagine the criteria of journals that are used for tenure and promotion to be more inclusive and not simply the highest rating or most popular? In other words, how might we value more journals and authors of color for tenure and promotion and use in one's curriculum? Dr. Williams, any thoughts?
Plenty. That's the reason I went into administration to begin with and bang my head up against that wall. We operate on a 19th century model of promotion and tenure, which operates to the detriment not only of scholars of color, but for the immediacy of work that would involve the academy to be engaged in the real pressing issues that face communities across this country with regard to First Nation peoples, African Americans, women. The fact of the matter is that the academy replicates the elitism that many of us point to as an impediment to dealing with the deep structural issues which we define as central to issues of poverty, racial inequality, and injustice that permeate our systems and structures. And I say that because as dean, it was one of my priorities to help reimagine that process. We need to create pathways for people who do community engaged scholarship to navigate the promotion and tenure process, and to do so in a way where they're not worried about meeting some artificial benchmark of acceptability in the academy, which is predicated on the 17 people in their discipline who are going to read their article and deem it useful and worthy of membership in the guild, as opposed to the potentially thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who could be served by that work. I'll give you a good example from my experience as dean. I had a faculty member in exercise science who had put together a tool to test mobility in elderly, what he called senior athletes. Absolutely brilliant. And his argument was, and it was just fascinating, that particularly in communities of color, there were stumbling blocks for senior athletes when, because of social issues and other issues, if they encountered one of these slip and fall incidents, there wasn't the structures necessary to help rehabilitate and get them comfortable with, getting back in and being mobile again. Now, this is valuable research to me. This is my lived experience. This is my great grandmother so I'm listening to him and I'm saying this is great. And I'm also listening to a department that doesn't get it. And a department that's saying, that's a great resource and tool, but that's service. And I'm like, no, that's scholarship. And if it was your grandmother or someone in your community that was facing this challenge, you'd be viewing that very differently. Well, we were able to have him partner with the YWCA St. Paul. The first night that he was able to premiere that research there, over 200 people showed up, and the Y pointed it out as one of the most successful programs they'd had. He was addressing in a very tangible way the fact that the biggest impediments to slip and fall, particularly in communities of color, is not the fact that of muscle memory. The muscle doesn't forget. What happens is these kind of cultural things intervene, and he had created tools to help people, physical therapists and others work through those to understand how to reach that community. Well, I'm pleased to say that he was awarded tenure, but my problem is I should never have had to fight that battle. Now I realize this is a diocesan school I'm at now, and I miss the Jesuits terribly, because I feel like this was a little bit of an easier fight at a Jesuit institution to appeal to mission in a way that's tangible, that people can recognize. This is the work that we should be doing, and it should transcend just what happens in a particular journal. At the same time, and I will be very transparent about this, and my own career has been marked by this. I would be remiss in this moment to tell a junior colleague not to pursue those traditional pathways, particularly colleagues of color, because I know that they face other obstacles which can impact their ability to meet that benchmark. And at the same time, I am forestalling creative, talented brilliant people who have something to contribute immediately to problems that are facing our communities. And I'm telling them, wait 6 years, 7 years until you get tenure, and then you can pivot and do that work. Taking them away when they have the energy, the drive, the inspiration, the talent to be able to do that, and redirecting them in avenues which, quite frankly, in many instances aren't beneficial, and sometimes preventing them from being able to redirect, redeploy, reimagine their scholarship and their research, even their very identity as scholars, to serve larger needs that impact our community. We have to move from university to community. That's the future. And if we're going to talk about this, particularly in mission-driven institutions, and I think the Jesuit schools can be leaders in this regard, they have to redefine what that means. And that begins with jailbreaking faculty, reimagining these artificial barriers and structures, which really in many cases hurt, not help, the ability of scholars to address issues of real import in our communities.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and really appreciate the concrete examples that you're giving that affects real people at the same time.
The question is really important for those in power. So chairs, if you are the chair of the P&T committee in your department, if you are the one writing the narrative for the college committee, if you're the one writing the narrative, I mean, I know deans supposedly write all their narratives, but if you're writing the first draft for your dean, when you are chair and asking for external letters, how are you crafting that letter? Are you just using the standard language that has been used for the last 25 years, or are you crafting a letter that actually speaks to the value of your discipline, your college, the mission, and so forth? But I, like Dr. Williams, I've not had a straight line research trajectory because I was denied tenure and had to restart at a different institution. Despite having a book contract, despite having 3 of those chapters done. And oh, by the way, the book is now award winning and gets adopted in interdisciplinary classrooms, but they did not see my value at the time that I went up for tenure. And also because I don't fit neatly into political science. I'm more of a sociologist, historian, and I use ethnography and focus groups, and they were like, where's your regression analysis? And I'm like, where are the people in my regression analysis? And they looked at me as like, but where's your regression analysis? I'm like, where are the people? And so that I stayed true, but as Dr. Williams just said, he can't tell junior people to stay true to your research because there are then financial, social, economic, job-related real consequences. Oh, I wasn't gonna say financial, economic. I was gonna say financial and relationship, professional, blah, blah, blah.
And really appreciate that the message is particularly for those empowered and those decision makers for the time being too. So,
can I add one more thing, Ray, very quickly, because Dr. Middlemass just reminded me of something important too. The other challenge here is fit, and I hear this all the time from faculty of color. This really disturbs me greatly, and I think we need to talk about it as a community of scholars, not historians, political scientists, and as scholars. Dr. Middlemass's book, which is phenomenal, is a scholar. And so when I read it, I read scholarship. I think about her in the great tradition of a W.E.B. Du Bois, where we now celebrate intersectionality and we talk about the importance of interdisciplinarity. And the reality is that we punish that in scholarship. We punish that in departmental structures. Deans, provosts, academic leaders need to privilege interdisciplinary programs in interdisciplinarity, need to elevate interdisciplinary journals, need to reimagine pathways for community engaged scholarship, need to create pathways for teaching tracks where faculty who are doing the heavy lifting of teaching large undergraduate courses, teaching courses that are externally facing and are really about service learning, that all needs to be elevated in a way that you're creating pathways, because traditionally, that's where your scholars of color fall. That's where your women fall. And that's why we have problems in the academy with the tenure process for those individuals. It actually is punitive toward them. And I think deans and provosts have a lot of power. Now, again, you know, having fought this battle in multiple places, I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's the work that we need to do.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that addition. I know we're nearing the end of time, so to kind of close out our session, I was hoping I could turn to each of you for a final word that you'd like to share to the group. If I could start with you, Ms. Short-Colomb.
There's much work to be done. Let's keep doing. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you today. In person, kind of, sort of. See you next time.
Thank you very much. Dr. Middlemass?
Thank you for the invitation. The questions were fabulous. Thank you for the opportunity to share my experiences with you. And doing the work does not have to be massive. Institutions take a long time to change. So do the work in your office, do the work in your department. You don't have to do the heavy lifting to change the entire campus, to change the entire institution immediately. But if you start with a small place where you have impact, it will matter and it'll make the difference in students' lives.
Dr. Williams?
On Saturday, we'll recognize Juneteenth, which people sometimes talk about as Emancipation Day or the end of slavery in Texas. But I like to remind people that Emancipation Day really depended on when the Union Army arrived in your state and when the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in that state. I think it's a good model for us in our contemporary moment to realize, as John Lewis argued last summer in his final letter to the American people, that individuals collectively make history. And so don't wait around for Emancipation Day, for the savior, for the dean, for the provost, for the program shift, for the, we need to make that change. And I agree with Dr. Middlemass, and in this regard, recognize that if you wait, all it's doing is forestalling the work to be done. It's only a heavy lift if we assume that we don't have the power to move. And we certainly have the power to move in this moment. Today can literally be, and I think this is appropriate in terms of Jesuit education in particular. If you think about mission driven, and that's been a big part of this conversation, it's baked into the DNA and fabric of these institutions. We can push the boundaries of that, and we have to do that and be at the forefront, the vanguard of that work.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And thank you to all of our panelists and all of the audience for asking questions. Really, hopefully inspired to think about doing that work, continuing that work, or starting that work if you haven't. And love the opportunities for us to continue to speak truth to power. Thank you again, and allow me to turn over to Julio Vargas.
Thank you, Ray. So we are now going to turn our attention to our Jesuit examen. And before I get started, I want to acknowledge the AJCU's Eyes to See and Anti-Racism examen, from which I'm pulling my prompts for today. And so to get started, I invite you to take a couple of deep breaths. It's always good to ground ourselves in this place. And in what we have just heard, what we have witnessed, we're going to take this time to reflect upon that and to ask God's guidance upon that reflection. And so we'll come in the spirit of gratitude. Gratitude towards our panelists for their insights, for sharing their stories, and for the challenges that you've put before us. We are grateful for your contribution. And as we enter into a time of reflection, I invite you to reflect upon these prompts and pay attention to those emotions, those reactions you may have in these prompts. And we first look at where we have been. How have our institutions told their racial stories? Whose voices have been missing from our narratives? whose wounds have been excluded from our narratives as we talk about wounds producing narratives. What institutional conversations and decisions related to racial justice have we avoided because they were too inconvenient, too uncomfortable, or not a priority? What choices do we and others need to make to overcome these obstacles? As institutions, as Jesuit institutions, how have we responded to the anti-racism demands of our students, of our faculty, of our staff, and our surrounding community? We turn our attention to understanding the will of God and the call for justice. And we look at what are we doing now? What is my university's institution identification with the Black Lives Matter movement and other social movements calling for equity and inclusion? Are we actors or observers? Do our campus conversations specifically address issues relating to white privilege and not simply diversity? How is our work towards anti-racism moving beyond representation to explore issues of privilege, placement, and power? This is getting to the roots of racism, hitting those roots and not only the limbs. And where is the commitment to anti-racism most evident or least evident? In our research, in our selection of service sites, in our pedagogy and curriculum, in our strategic plan, in our committees, in our community relationships, in our hiring, in our liturgies and retreats, in our campus art and culture, in our recruitment and admissions policies. In our articulation of our Jesuit Catholic mission. We turn our attention now to a hopeful tomorrow and think about what ought to be. What kind of uncomfortable conversations will we now join or convene in order to move us forward? What are the most urgent needs on our campus with respect to racial justice? And how will our Black colleagues, our Indigenous colleagues, our people of color colleagues be essential in setting those priorities? How will we hold ourselves accountable to the moral imperative of anti-racism and the elevation of life? To end, I will read this poem. When we do not see the gravity of racial injustice, shake us from our slumber and open our eyes. When out of fear we are frozen to inaction, give us the spirit of bravery. When we try our best but say the wrong things, give us a spirit of humility. When the chaos of this dies down, give us a lasting spirit of solidarity. When it becomes easier to point our fingers outward, help us to examine our own hearts. God of truth, in your wisdom, enlighten us. God of love, in your mercy, forgive us. God of hope, in your kindness, heal us. Creator of all people, in your generosity, guide us. Racism breaks your heart. Break our hearts for what breaks yours. Amen.
Thank you so much, Malia. That was striking and beautiful and such an important and close to our sessions today. Thank you. Thank you very much, all the friends out there who participated in our session today. And I encourage you to act on everything that you have learned and share these sessions with your friends and your colleagues, and to be an active participant in this work for more racially just Jesuit higher education. So thank you to Ray Shu and to our plenary participants. And I've been remiss at not thanking our captioners. And I just feel it is very important to do so. Faith is our captioner today. I am a hard of hearing person. I rely on the captions. And so thank you, Faith, for doing such a wonderful job, and to your colleagues as well. Friends, we have our next plenary on Wednesday. We hope you join us. Thank you and have a blessed rest of the day wherever you are.